So my name is Neil Mahoney. I'm the Trioni Director of CEPR and a professor of economics here at Stanford. It is fantastic to see so many friends here in the room. We are starting with a conversation moderated by John Lyman. John has had a hugely successful career in the private sector and in policy, including his recent work with the Abundance Network here in the Bay Area. He just launched a fund named Telescope that focuses on early stage emerging technologies, including AI. I've had the pleasure of getting to know John over the last few months. I found him kind, supportive, smart, and insightful. And so I'm glad he was able to join us today. So thank you, John, and thank you, Derek, in advance, for kicking off today's conversation.
It's a very kind introduction. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Derek Kaufman. So Derek is the founder and CEO of Inclusive Abundance, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization building a dynamic community of notable policy experts, public officials, business leaders, and philanthropists to shape America's future through an abundance-focused agenda, which we're going to be talking quite a bit about. Prior to his work in policy philanthropy, Derek worked on Wall Street, first at JP Morgan, and then at the hedge fund Citadel, where he built and ran businesses making bets in the interest rate, currency, and mortgage markets. He studied applied math and economics at Harvard. Welcome, Derek.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for that warm introduction, John. And thanks to Neil and everyone at CEPR for hosting this important conversation and inviting me to speak. I'm here today to talk about operationalizing abundance. Abundance is a word, as an analytical framework, and as a political movement. First off, if you've heard that someone named Derek is speaking at an abundance conference, you are probably expecting a different guy. I am not Derek Thompson, although I'm a huge fan of his. His article, A Simple Plan to Solve America's Problems, was actually the spark that led me to found an organization called Inclusive Abundance. My name is Derek Kaufman. After a long career on Wall Street, I left the industry 10 years ago to try to make the world a better place through what I call policy philanthropy. Supporting work at think tanks, connecting great ideas to public officials and their staff, and organizing my peers in the business community to join in these efforts. When I first met the other Derek in 2023, he said he worried that abundance was a capacious word. That's why he has a New York Times bestseller and I don't. Abundance is clearly a word that can take on a variety of meanings. Conferences like this, and like the inaugural Abundance Conference we hosted last October in DC, help define it. And getting that definition right is so important because I believe abundance can help us navigate a path away from our current political polarization and dysfunction. And sometimes conferences can have unexpected outcomes, which I'll come back to at the very end of my remarks. As a word, abundance is the antithesis of scarcity. Now, of course, some scarcity is real. There are only so many seats in this room. There are engineering constraints that limit the height of a skyscraper. If you're curious, it's about a mile, although we've only achieved half of that, mostly because of economics. But much of the scarcity we experience in America today is self-imposed, driven by bad policy choices, misaligned incentives, powerful special interests, faulty narratives, and political gridlock. Take, for example, Pack Heights, where there's a 40-foot building height restriction, which is kind of ironic, given the name. The sky is not actually lower over that part of San Francisco, but the buildings are short because of policy, not physics. And yet, abundance is more than a catchy word. It is an analytical framework for identifying and dismantling the self-imposed scarcity that holds our country back. And this artificial scarcity comes from factions on both the left and the right. Let's start with scarcity on the left. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance, is very much a conversation with progressives. We see an extreme aversion to causing any specific person or desert tortoise or piece of landscape harm. But that ends up causing diffuse harm to everyone. We see what Nick Bagley calls a procedure fetish, and what Jen Pahlka has described as a calcification of layers upon layers of rules and regulations and red tape. In another recent book, Why Nothing Works, Mark Dunkelman shows us how a justifiable reaction to people like Robert Moses, who literally bulldozed marginalized communities, has created a deep fear of giving decision makers real authority. But when nobody is in charge, every decision gets bogged down in the complexity of competing viewpoints. And the incorporation of community voice into our decision-making process has often been hijacked into something deeply anti-democratic. Who shows up at the town meeting evaluating a new apartment complex? Often, they are who Ezra calls Marin County liberals. People with a not in my backyard or NIMBY mindset. Older, wealthier people with an abundance of time. Who doesn't show up? The single mom juggling kids and multiple jobs, who can't yet even afford to live in that community, wasn't invited to the meeting, and doesn't have the child care time to attend. Add to this mix the degrowth mentality of parts of the environmental and anti-capitalist left. The Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council are the top litigants using NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, to block clean energy projects. Back in the 60s and 70s, they, like your former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, built up giant muscles, the kind of political muscle that stopped coal plants and toxic polluters in their tracks. But the tech stack has changed. The cost of wind and solar has plummeted. We've got new tools, battery storage, next generation nuclear, and deep geothermal. We don't need beefy linebackers slowing us down. We need marathoners who can help us build green infrastructure fast, with determination, with endurance, and with focus. We need to have the body type of elite runners like my hero, Eliud Kipchoge, not the governator. The irony is that these supposedly progressive forces, from Marin County liberals to environmental groups like the Sierra Club, are at heart deeply conservative in their aims. Conserve habitat, no matter how tiny the parcel at stake or how high the cost to broader climate goals. Stop development, even for projects that offer great benefits to the general public. Freeze a community's character and time at the expense of dynamism and economic mobility. In other words, the exact opposite of the progress that should be the root of progressivism. Now let's look at scarcity on the right. We see skepticism of high-return public investments, science funding, advanced market commitments like Operation Warp Speed, the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which helps finance large projects like nuclear power plants. We see a zero-sum mentality on trade, placing tariffs on our allies. We see false narratives opposing high-skilled immigration and the slashing of safety net programs that alleviate child poverty. We also see a preference for government efficiency over effectiveness, which has led to some of DOJ's significant missteps, which we'll discuss in the conversation with John. From both sides, we're stuck with antiquated systems, well-organized special interests, and a politics that lets polarization get in the way of solving problems and getting shit done. We are beholden to scarcity factions in both parties. It doesn't have to be this way. How do we overcome the scarcity factions? By building abundance as a political movement. Abundance scrambles traditional left-right distinctions and is ideologically and sectorally inclusive. I founded Inclusive Abundance to help organize a growing community of scholars, think tank experts, thought leaders, advocacy organizations, business people, philanthropic funders, public officials, and their staff. Kindred spirits finding common cause under the banner of abundance. People from across the ideological spectrum who are collaborating to build more housing, invest in clean energy, advance scientific innovation and technological progress, and make government work better for everyone. We built a team to identify, support, and amplify smart ideas, organize events big and small, coordinate lobbying and advocacy efforts in DC and beyond. We operate both a 501c3 and C4 to enable a wide variety of activities. We build community through conferences, happy hours. We just had a great one on Monday night in San Francisco that some of you attended, and salon-style dinners. We published a landscape directory and analysis of the abundance policy and advocacy ecosystem, featuring over 100 organizations doing great work in the space. Check it out on our website's Abundance in Action section at inclusiveabundance.org. We encourage donors to support both our partners in the ecosystem and the public officials ready to lead. Because it's not enough to ask someone to take a brave stand against a well-organized special interest group opposing a piece of legislation or a development project. It's much better to create positive incentives for them to do the right thing. The momentum is building for philanthropic support of the broader ecosystem. This year, a major funder, Open Philanthropy, announced a $120 million Abundance and Growth Fund to be distributed over the next 3 years. When explaining the rationale behind this new area of focus. They cited last October's Abundance Conference as one of the inspirations for the launch of the fund. We're excited to see how they allocate it. We are busy turning ideas into action, hosting conversations with public officials to socialize and explain the abundance framework, engaging in targeted lobbying on bills like the Energy Permitting Reform Act of 2024, the proposal from Senators Joe Manchin and John Barrasso that nearly became law last year. We're eager to make a bill like that a reality in this Congress. Just last week, we helped launch the bipartisan Congressional Build America Caucus, led by Congressman Josh Harder, with nearly 30 members across both parties coming together to cut red tape and allow us to build better, faster, and cheaper. We're eager to contribute to the success of this caucus. Energy permitting and transmission reform will be at the top of their agenda. Before we transition to the conversation with John and each of you, let me end with one tangible story of impact, the unexpected outcome I had mentioned earlier. Last October, one of our conference speakers was J.D. Grome, who at the time was working with Gina Raimondo on CHIPS implementation at the Commerce Department. J.D. happens to now be a senior advisor at Inclusive Abundance, who was the guy who helped us get the Build America Caucus off the ground. He brought his intern, Victoria Wren, to the DC event. She was so inspired that she came back to campus and founded Stanford Abundance. And that's why I'm here with you today, to encourage more of you to join the movement through academic research, campus community building, organizing grassroots activism, political engagement, philanthropic funding, and more. To tell your friends and colleagues about abundance and encourage their involvement, and to tell them to do the same with their friends. You can go to our website to sign up for our quarterly newsletter to learn more about abundance updates and events delivered straight to your inbox. Please reach out to Victoria or to me and let us know how we can help you help us operationalize abundance and turn these important ideas into action. Because we need abundance to be more than just a word, more than a book, more than an academic approach to solving America's problems. We need it to become a vibrant political movement, one that makes artificial scarcity scarce. Thank you.
All righty. So abundance as a movement, as we all know, is not really that old, 3 years at most. The last 18 months, I think, in particular, have been very interesting. You've done a lot of work over the last 18 months. Now we've got this moment where Ezra and other Derek, and that is what we're going to call him because he's not here. That's the other Derek. This is our Derek. Wrote this book that was a huge hit and seems to have entered the national conversation. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing over the last 18 months and where you think abundance as a movement can and should go over the next 18 months.
Right. So I think in any new movement, it starts with ideas, and this was in the form of New York Times and Atlantic articles written by a variety of thought leaders. It inspired me to think about operationalizing and organizing. And so in late 2023, I launched Inclusive Abundance Initiative, which is our C3. We hired a couple of people. In March of 2024, we hosted our first conference. It was with other Derek and Jen Palka and Kristen Dorgalo, looking at federal government capacity and thinking a little bit about how, this was before Doge was a word, but how we could work on making government work better and getting a community of people together to do that. Much of the time between that conference and October was really building out and meeting the community with the goal of showing the world that abundance had hundreds of people, from the ideas people to the public officials to the funders, who were real and doing work. And so in October of last year, this showcase conference, which you can see at abundanceconference.org, was the first gathering in substantial form in DC, proving that this was happening. The next 6 months, we put together this caucus, and we're really excited about the DC version of this, but clearly there are many people in this room who are also working and have been working for longer than I've been involved on the California version. And the traction that the book really amplified is exciting. And so now the question is, what do we do? And I think there are many things. So Victoria's campus chapter is a prototype that I would love to see replicated at 20 more campuses and then 100. Like, you could imagine the work that she's done and the model, sort of teaching classes, having speakers come. I could envision a digital publication for students. You have campus Democrats and campus Republicans on many campuses. Like, we should have campus abundance across the country. I think that there is a political organizing project that's really important. And this is an academic conference, so I won't go into too many details, but I think that finding ways to get funders pooling their resources behind candidates who are doing the right work is a really important project. And this has been done with many other special interest groups, right? So like the NRA has done this, and Planned Parenthood has done this, and AIPAC has done this, where you get people who want to see an outcome put their political giving behind that outcome. So how do we do that at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level for abundance? And then there's really just teaching public officials this new language, because it isn't completely spread throughout the ecosystem. And so what are the policy tools at their disposal, and how do they use the messaging and communications to convince the retail end user? And I don't think abundance is necessarily the word, right? It's like abundance is a little bit of an elite organizing word right now. What is it about? It's about bringing costs down for people. It's about increasing economic mobility and opportunity to make people's lives better. It's about national security. It's about making the US have a kind of thriving economy that can produce both technological innovation and material goods in a global competition for influence. And so using those deliverable goals and using the analytical approach and using the community and putting those all together in a retail version of something that is popular with voters, I think is another part.
Absolutely, and I agree with all of those. So I think many of us, partially because of where we are in California, originally came to abundance through housing, right? I know that I did through the Abundance Network and some other groups in California. But I think that's been covered pretty extensively. We're also in a geographic location in Silicon Valley where new technologies are developing every day, particularly AI. We all know that AI is coming. We all know also that it's going to be incredibly energy intensive. A little while later, we're going to hear from a panelist who is making fusion happen, which is exciting. But assuming that doesn't solve everything overnight, how would abundance, in your view, deal with energy, transmission lines, permitting, et cetera?
Yeah, so the statistics are pretty stark. From the early 2000s until a year or two ago, electricity demand and electricity generation in the United States was a flat line. It's like literally zero growth. And this is because the economy grew, but the efficiency offset that. And so the economy became less electricity intense, more efficient, and we didn't need to be building electricity generation. Over the next few years, demand is expected to grow at 3 to 5% a year. So it's a complete hockey stick from like a flat line to a pretty steep slope. So we're talking about something like 15 to 20% growth by the end of this decade. And that's driven in part by data centers going from 4% of current US electricity consumption to potentially 12% a few years from now. The power of these tools is making adoption increase more rapidly than almost any new technology. And the power of the frontier models is making the demand for training runs increase. And so you have both the inference and the training driving exceptional demand. And right now it takes 10 years to build a transmission line on average. And the interconnection queue to connect solar to the grid went from 2 years to 5 years. The amount of solar projects sitting, waiting to be plugged in, has gone up by like 20 times in the last 10 years. And so
in a lot of ways, we're actually going in reverse.
So there's no way that without substantial changes, we're going to be able to build the electricity generation capability as fast as we need it. Now, Tyler will speak later on a panel about some ways that we can squeeze more out of the existing grid. And Duncan has some things about how you can sort of do small-scale solar and put it near the data center. So there'll be clever solutions that work against the current rule set. But if you look at what could happen in terms of federal policy, for the next 4 years, we have a Republican president. And so anything that's going to become law is going to require that administration support. And Congress has very thin majorities, and they could switch in the next election, at least in the House. So you're going to need to have a bipartisan consensus in order to get a 60-vote bill through the Senate. And I think that the combination of national security, kind of competitiveness with China, innovation, like all of these line up in a fairly cross-partisan framework to get something done. And the current state of the world, if you want to build an oil or gas pipeline, which runs for multiple hundreds of miles, and you're trying to build all the right of way, and there's some holdout in the middle, like eminent domain is a tool in the federal government's toolkit to kind of get the whole thing done. If you want to build a linear electric transmission line, it's much, much harder to do that, which is crazy. And so how do you give the federal government a little bit more authority to be able to get those long-run linear transmission lines built? How do you speed up the permitting and approval process for building especially clean energy? But I think having some natural gas in there is going to be part of the mix for grid reliability. How do you change the ability to sue and who's allowed to sue? And Arnab has done a lot of work on this, and he'll be on a panel later. All of these things need to happen really, really fast if we're going to meet the moment. And so we're excited to the federal level, and I would love to get more people in this room involved in making those changes so we can generate enough electricity to meet the demand that's coming fast.
So speaking to the federal level, something that's been in the news a lot recently, which I think has some abundance identification or correlation, is DOGE. And Jen Pahlka, who many of us in this room know, I think when the idea came out but had yet to be implemented, wrote an interesting piece on it saying, oh, there's some things here maybe we want to look at in terms of government efficiency and operational capacity. And yet at the same time, operationally, it doesn't seem like DOGE has perhaps had the impact that even it thought it would. What would Abundance's take or your take be on DOGE?
Yeah, it's a great question and a complicated question. I would start with the words. So DOGE is the Department of Government Efficiency. And efficiency generally means like doing the same thing with less. I would argue that effectiveness is a much better word. So there's a debate about how much government should do. And then there's, I think, less of a debate that whatever government does, it should do really, really well. And it should be able to do an effective job. The problem that I've seen with DOGE is they've commingled a whole bunch of really important concepts into one frame. So the deficit in this country is unsustainably large. 6 or 7% of GDP, near full employment, is really bad. And so the idea that you would like to either cut spending or increase taxes or both to get the deficit closer to a sustainable 3% of GDP seems really sensible. The challenge is that most of that is non-discretionary. So it's entitlements, it's interest on the debt, and then it's defense. And the federal workforce, if you got rid of all of it, would not solve your problem. But it's not clear that everybody understands that. And so the idea of like getting rid of federal employees to cut the deficit has become a mimetic, but not really substantial. The second thing that is inside of DOGE is regulatory relief. Right, so I think there is a calcification of rules and regulations. There are regulations that made sense 3 decades ago that don't serve our purposes today. There's a compounding effect of regulations. It's really easy to add them. It's hard to take them away. And I think in the original Vivek and Elon team of DOGE, Vivek was more of the deregulatory guy, and he didn't last. But thinking about, especially after the Supreme Court's decision of Loeber-Bright, which changed this doctrine of Chevron deference, like how the rulemaking works in agencies and how you could probably streamline some of that is a second objective. The third is just that government is pretty inefficient. So when I started at JP Morgan in 1996, JP Morgan, which was a sophisticated financial services firm, made the decision to outsource its IT development to IBM in a cost-plus contract. And this was like state-of-the-art, 1998, that they're going to do the servers, they're going to do the databases, they're going to do the full stack development, and JP Morgan will just do the kind of top-level strategy and specification. This was exactly when Al Gore and Bill Clinton were doing reinventing government. And so they used the same approach, which is like, let's outsource this stuff. Let's not do it in government, because government is not an IT expert. The thing is, like 10 to 15 years later, with agile development and the cloud and open source, every corporate brought it all back inside and hired excellent people and paid them and was able to do iterative development where the people who were using the product and the people who were developing the product sat next to each other, and you didn't need to spec out like what the 10-year deliverable was and hope you got it right on the first draft. But the federal government has not done that. And so if you look, federal employees have been flat for 3 decades, and everyone points to that statistic. But it's because we've outsourced so much of this at cost plus or cost plus plus contracting, and the procurement is ugly, and the ability to innovate is ugly. And so that part of DOGE, like procurement reform, IT modernization, is a third piece. And the fourth piece I would say is customer experience. So after the election and before inauguration, Elon Musk said, we should have a tax filing app. I'm like, heck yeah, we should have a tax filing app. The IRS actually built something called Direct File Pilot, which was a down payment on a tax filing app, that Doge has canceled. Now, an argument could be that they canceled it because they're going to build something better. So let's support that. And if we live in the year 2025, like just fantasize for a moment that you had sophisticated biometric login. So it knew exactly who you were. And then it filled out everything the government knows about your income for you, right? Which at the end of the day, the IRS is checking it after you file. So why not just give it to you before you file? And if it's missing something, it's on you to say, hey, you didn't have this 1099. I'm going to, I'll put it in. If they have everything, you just click a button. And then imagine that now it knows your income, it knows your family structure, and it enrolls you in SNAP, and it enrolls you in EITC, and it enrolls you in every benefit program. And now there's no benefit fraud because we know who you are, we know your income, and you get those benefits. So we could have, I imagine, this like center-left, center-right synthesis where you minimize the burden of filing taxes, you ease benefit access while minimizing benefit fraud. Like this to me would be Doge.
And it's cheaper.
It's cheaper. And so I would love us to see a customer experience delivery focus. I would love us to see an IT modernization, procurement, civil service reform, hire and pay great people to do the work in government. That might mean that you lose over time some employees because you've automated. I think how AI meets Doge is really, really interesting. Like over the next 5 years, the capabilities of models to streamline regulations, to simplify, to have customer service. It's really interesting. So I would love us, potentially through the Build America Caucus, through ideas from people in this room, to suggest what is good Doge, right? And to get behind that in a meaningful way.
So you just mentioned the Build America Caucus. It launched last week. Tell us a little bit about that, how it came about. It seems very bipartisan. What are some of the early goals? What are the chances for legislation being passed before the midterms?
What's interesting is abundance is kind of two projects at once, I think. So one project is how do you rebuild the Democratic Party with a giant abundance faction? How do you get the Democratic Party to be abundance Democrats? A second part of the abundance project is how do you build bridges between the abundance factions in both parties to get stuff done? The word abundance, because of Other Derek and Ezra's book, has definitely taken on a little bit of a first project coding. And so when we were thinking about forming and supporting a group of bipartisan members of Congress, I thought abundance could be a word, but it's probably not the right word. And second, as I said, it's a little bit of an elite word still. It's not a retail word. Personally, I wanted to call it the Get Shit Done Caucus, or Get Stuff Done Caucus, because I think that's the animating principle. The communications people who are much better at their jobs than I am.
They vetoed that.
They thought maybe Build America sounded like pretty simple and good, so we went with the Build America Caucus. I have a lot of relationships in Congress. Our partners across the ideological spectrum have a lot of relationships in Congress. J.D. Grome, who I mentioned in the speech, ran the House New Dems, which is the moderate Democratic Congressional Caucus, for 8 years. So we worked together across the partner ecosystem, with our own relationships, with JD's relationships, to corral a bipartisan group of 29 members to get together. And having a vehicle that can serve the entire community, so you know where to go if you want to do something in abundance, felt like a huge public good. But now there's a lot of work. So forming the caucus was easy. Launching the caucus was really fun. It was one of the best days of my life on Thursday of last week, sitting in the Capitol Triangle. 15 members spoke. You can geek out for 20 minutes and watch the YouTube video. I think half of them said, we are here to get stuff done. So those words came out in the press conference, so that part was nice. Scott Peters, who's one of the best Dems on permitting reform in the House, actually I think put get shit done in his press release. So I was pretty excited about that. He's on the vanguard of this movement.
He's cutting edge.
He's cutting edge. And I mentioned Scott because the first thing that they need to do is to work on a energy permitting and transmission, because I think after the Republicans finish tax through reconciliation, which is not bipartisan, that is Republicans using 50 votes in the Senate to get something done, there's going to be a window between the fall, to the extent that wraps up, and the spring when everyone starts running for re-election, where you could get some stuff through. I don't think that that's a foregone conclusion. I think it's going to be a lot of work. There are various pieces of opposition. We need to figure out how to mobilize this whole community to talk to Republicans who have some concerns about certain parts, to talk to the environmental groups who have concerns about other parts. It's going to be something that everyone has a piece that they hate, right? Any bipartisan compromise inherently is going to have something that people hate, but it's going to have a lot that's amazing.
But fair to say that Fix Our Forests, which is a wildfire bill, looks promising, not done yet, which is abundance aligned. And then energy could happen this session too, we just don't know yet.
Yeah, Fix Our Forests is great. So that actually was Scott Peters and Bruce Westerman in the House. There's a few Senate co-sponsors. It's a bill that lets you cut down trees in forests that might burn easier without going through all the environmental review. And in the House, I believe 64 Democrats voted for it only, okay? Because some of the environmentalists don't want to cut down trees. And there's been messaging that trees solve climate change. So I think trees are beautiful, and we should have trees. But if you allow a forest to become a fire hazard, and it all goes up in smoke, you've done more harm to your climate goals than you would have by cutting down the trees to prevent the massive conflagration. The fact that only 64 Dems voted for it is one of the challenges of abundance. By the way, one thing I hope to do over time is that we introduce more and more pieces of legislation that are abundance legislation, and we can start ranking how people vote on those pieces of legislation and tell everyone that there's a scorecard. And then we would know who are abundance and who are scarcity politicians. And to be that scorekeeper, and you see these there's lots of other organizations have scorecards. I think this would be useful to exist federally. I think it'd be useful to exist in states. Like part of a new movement is how do you call balls and strikes so people know who's doing what. Fix Our Forests, I hope will pass. It's a great bill. And then let's get on to the next things. I would just say quickly to finalize what the caucus could do. They're interested in housing and transit. Housing and transit is certainly part of abundance. As you said, it's kind of the OG part of abundance. I'm not sure what the federal levels are for housing. First of all, at all. There's some good ideas, and there'll be a panel that talks about some of it, but much of that is at the state and local level. And I'm not sure how much the administration wants to do like upzoning blue cities as part of the project, but I hope they do. What good DOGE looks like and what the legislative input is in that, I think could be really interesting to work on. And then what is our science and innovation policy, especially in this AI moment? So how do you make sure AI serves human flourishing? How do you do a research project to control and align and secure the frontier AIs so that they are leading to the outcomes humans want? How do you use AI to advance the frontiers of science? How do we make the public investments, potentially with the frontier labs, potentially with academia, to create AI for the public good, which the frontier labs themselves, who are engaged in both an arms race with each other and globally an arms race against adversaries, they may not be doing enough of that kind of work. And there's clearly like a workforce issue in our own federal government. If we want to deploy AI in the federal government, there's a giant hiring push that's going to need to happen to get that talent on board. And so I think that there's a lot of room legislatively for that. So I'd say energy, good DOGE, and AI and science policy. And quite frankly, that's like a triangle. They all intersect. So we need the energy policy to do the AI. We need to reform how government works to do the permitting better. And AI can help us improve both government and scientific innovation.
We're going to go to Q&A. As folks think of their questions, 30 seconds or less on where people can find out more about abundance.
Thank you for asking. So the Abundance book is great. Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkelman is great. There's a book, Stuck by Yoni Applebaum. We decided, because we wanted to make sure that we expressed the abundance views from the classical liberals and from the right and from the left, we put together a primer. So if you go to inclusiveabundance.org and you go to the Abundance in Action section, there's a primer right at the top that has a reading list of about 30 articles and books that come across both general abundance and the 4 main issue areas of housing, energy, innovation, and government effectiveness. There are also 100+ orgs doing work. Some of them are conservative climate groups that are looking at nuclear and geothermal. Some of them are liberal San Francisco housing groups. And all of these are also on this Abundance Action page in a landscape analysis. And then I would encourage you to find the org that fits you, right? And talk to some of the leaders of the orgs. And some of these orgs need money. Some of these orgs need people and advocacy help. Some of these orgs need ideas. And so we just wanted to put together in one place a set of resources that help people. And then if you're interested in the political part of the project, just come talk to me, because I have a lot of thoughts on that too that I won't share on stage.
All right, questions? Go ahead.
Thanks. Derek, I like that you mentioned a couple times Mark Duckelman's book. I really enjoyed it as well. And I found his framing of the sort of like rival Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian instincts to be a useful framing and explanatory. But I also saw it presenting a tension that I haven't really heard very well resolved at a theoretical level around, I guess one way of framing it is like, what's the appropriate role for voice, like public voice and public input? And especially, I don't love the like populist term populism, but a lot of people say that we're in a populist moment now. And I think it's easy to imagine a populist reaction to like a perceived technocratic approach to government. And I haven't heard a lot on a theoretical level about like what is abundance's sort of framing around that.
Yeah, this is a really hard question. There's lots of levels of how granular you want to be locally, right? So, you know, is it the community board? Is it the town or city? Is it the region? Is it the state? Is it federal? And we have elections, right? So like there is a biannual or every 4-year community voice where, you know, everyone votes. And then some of the processes that are designed are the antithesis of that democratic process, because you get very loud people who feel extremely who show up, and that's not necessarily representative. And so one of the questions is just, does the mayor get to say, I want to hear what everyone says and weigh it, and then I'm going to make the decision because I've been elected to make that decision. And we've seen that state legislators who've taken good votes in California on things, like they don't get removed from office, right? And people were loud, and there are 40 people who are loud, and there were 3 people who show up in the meeting who are supportive, but there's 10,000 people who just don't show up in the meeting, and like they overwhelmingly support it. But you also want to think about ways to more efficiently gather input. So maybe there's online tools that you use where you can get more, you know, you make the barrier to providing input lower, and you know, you can weigh that input using AI tools, right? Like you could imagine a more sophisticated technological design to gather input broadly rather than have it in these in-person, you know, caucus-like forums. But I think political scientists in the room and people, like, there's lots of people who probably will give you better answers than I will, and I think we should think about the system design of this that produces better outcomes while respecting, you know, a diversity of viewpoints.
Next question, and why don't you give us your name and your affiliation right here?
Hi, Jeanette Garrity. When you were talking about the scorecard, Derek, you may not have intended this, but you seem to be focusing in on the Democratic side of the aisle. Is that because you think the Republicans are already on board with this, or is that just natural constituency or something like that?
Oh, yeah, so I didn't mean to give that impression at all. I think that there are, as I described in the talk, the scarcity Republican and the scarcity Democratic opposition are different. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to the Republicans are very into the deregulatory part of the agenda and not into the provision of high return public goods part of the agenda, and the Democrats are the opposite. And so if you look at things like science funding or the regional tech hubs in CHIPS and science, or even the CHIPS bill, that passed bipartisan, but it had Republican opposition. And then you look at Fix Our Forests, which passed bipartisan, but had more Democratic opposition. And so I think you're going to need to have a set of bills that touch on both parties, scarcity and abundance factions. And the way you'll score the scarcity versus abundance Republicans will be a different set of bills, right? They will align differently around bills than the abundance versus scarcity Democrats. And I think it's important to score both. That particular Fix Our Forest example was one which was more of the deregulatory part, which is why it's skewed that way.
Thank you. I'm Caroline Spears. So you talked about some of the policies that you're hoping to pass with 60 votes in the Senate. Most policies are passing through reconciliation. We have a massive reconciliation bill up in front of Congress right now. Can you be more specific about what policies you're hoping to see out of reconciliation, especially with Loan Programs Office, science funding, and some of the investments and some of the cutting 18F, things
Yeah.
like that are kind of in the reconciliation bill in front of Congress at the moment.
Yeah. So there's obviously like legitimate debate about many of the IRA tax credits. And from an intellectual framework, the goal of supporting great technologies before they're mature so that you can bring down the cost curve, I think is very appealing. And for like historical examples, when we started making computer chips in the 60s, NASA and the DoD bought 90% of the chips that came off the fab line. They were $3,000 a chip. They failed half the time. They were not commercially viable, but they were your only answer if you wanted to get a rocket to go to a specific place, which was really important at the time. And so you'd pay almost any amount of money for that. 5 years later, you did Moore's Law, and they were pre-commercially viable, and 5 years after that, they were commercially viable. So I think that the same concept, which, by the way, Operation Warp Speed was sort of that concept. So like having a robust set of technology-neutral tax credits that encourages the maturation of next-generation technology, I think is really important. Subsidizing a mature technology, because it has carbon benefits, I think you need to look at the carbon cost of those subsidies. And so I think that they're debating exactly how much to scale those back because they want money to do other things, and the deficit's too big. And I'm hopeful that they leave in place the ones that accomplish the objectives of letting us have energy abundance in a carbon efficient way and speed to technology. Loan Programs Office, I think, is great, and especially for nuclear. So that cost curve example, if we want to build small modular reactors in America at scale and fast, the first one we build is going to be absolutely an economic boondoggle. Like, it will not be cost effective. And I would love us to know what that cost curve looks like. So you build 1 and you build 5 and you build 10 and you build 20. Is that yet commercially viable? You build 50. If by 100 they're not commercially viable, we have a problem. But I think that it's worth the investment in either grants or loans to start getting the data on what that cost curve looks like. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's how I'm thinking about it. The last thing I'd say in reconciliation is budgetary. So you can't do legal changes in it, per se. But there's a, I would say, clever idea that if you want a permit, you can pay for it. And then you can become exempt from NEPA and not have to do your environmental impact statement. So this is interesting that they sort of try to roll back NEPA by using a financial tool. There's also like great debates on both sides about how much we should roll back or repeal NEPA. NEPA is a procedural act, right? So there's a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act and an Endangered Species Act. There's lots of laws that prevent environmental damage. NEPA is not that kind of law. NEPA is a law that says you have to go through a whole bunch of hoops and check a whole bunch of counterfactuals and show what your environmental impact is. It wasn't even intended as that. It was intended as just an interagency quick review. It's become thousands of pages and months and years of delay. The argument for NEPA is that it makes those other substantive laws bite harder. And so by having it, you kind of increase the adherence to the other laws. But the law still exists even if you don't have all of the NEPA review. And so I think there's a pretty strong case to materially roll it back. And if you can do that with this pay for permit, that might be one way to get it through without needing to go through a 60 vote threshold. But I'd love to see like proper legislative changes to NEPA after they get through reconciliation.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more. Let's go here. And then I want you to make sure that you tell us, this is a great conference, and thank you to Stanford and CEPR for hosting, but I want you to tell us about the other conferences that are coming up in the fall.
Great.
Go ahead.
Barry Smith from Stanford. Great presentation. I particularly liked the IRS one because it was a win-win-win, which often it's win, lose, lose, or something like that. With regards to housing and abundance, one of the key things you stated is how can we reduce the cost, make it cheaper? What are 2 or 3 key things that we could do to make housing cheaper?
So I think the number one thing is housing construction productivity. So someone, I don't remember who, so I apologize to whoever's name I'm forgetting, made the example that imagine when you bought a new car, all the parts were delivered to your garage and a team showed up and assembled the car in your driveway, right? Like the car would cost a whole lot more. And that's basically how we're building housing. And something that you can manufacture and mass produce and learn and innovate is cheaper. And that's why all of the manufactured goods we see in our consumption basket have declined massively in price. Housing is still this bespoke, highly labor-intensive process. There is a way to do like modular construction and to use manufactured housing and to think about construction productivity. The problem is housing is cyclical, so it's hard to make the massive capital investments. So there's a question of like what the government role is to help people ride through those cycles. There are building codes that sort of encourage all sorts of crazy behavior with how many staircases and how big elevators are, right? And so those codes all had a good answer. There's a New York Times article about elevator size in the US versus Europe, where you need to have a stretch. Our codes say you need a stretcher to be able to be perfectly flat in any elevator, like just in case you needed to get the person out. And like all regulations, for the one person who really needed to get brought down to that stretcher quickly, that sounds like a great regulation. For the 10,000 homeless people we have, because we made it really expensive to build, and the downstream effect of that is you have all these homeless people, it's kind of bad. And so that would be my answer for housing away from just zoning. For the conferences, to finish up, first of all, thank you, this was awesome, really fun. On September 3rd to 5th in DC, there's gonna be Abundance 2025, the second iteration of the conference that we put together last year. I think September 14th through 16th in New Haven is YIMBY Town. YIMBY Town is, there were 600 people in Austin at last year's YIMBY Town, and Scott Wiener, who will be on the stage later, a liberal Democrat from California, and Greg Gianforte, the conservative governor of Montana, both spoke, and they probably don't agree on a whole lot, but they both were really excited about upzoning where they lived. So YIMBY Town brings together these crazy new coalitions. And then here, in your backyard, later in October, is a Roots of Progress conference. The progress studies people are probably maybe more like traditionally right-leaning part of Abundance. It's about using science and technology and innovation to create prosperity. I would check that out. Like they've had incredible speakers, and the YIMBY Town in New Haven and the progress studies in San Francisco and Abundance in DC, I think just completely covers all of the elements of this community and all of the ways that it's being framed.
And just to be clear in closing, Derek's nice. He doesn't want to tell you where that conference actually is because of where we are right now. It's in Berkeley.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
This was awesome. Thanks, everyone.